Thank you for coming today. So my name is Saul Hansen, and so I've been working in the architecture industry for about 10 years now. And while I worked at Bernardo Wills, I specialized in multifamily and in housing, and that's mainly what I worked on in helping out on the drafting and code side of things. And that's where I wanted to be. I figured that technology has reached an age where between technology and manufacturing, I think that housing will be revolutionized in my lifetime. That's kind of like the conclusion that I came to. And I decided that I wanted to be involved in that and contribute to that in some way. And so that was kind of the clarity. I'm like, I want to be involved in housing. And then as I was going through and just doing some budgeting type things, I said, oh my gosh, like housing accounts for a pretty large portion of someone's income. And so if we can figure out a way to create more affordable housing, not just for like Section 8 housing, but just for anyone, then it can free up a lot of their resources to just increase their quality of life. That entire idea or concept is what got me into architecture and being able to be involved in that. So from the get-go, I was running everything through the lens of like, how can I cater my education to work specifically towards creating alternative housing solutions. So this course will explore the application of Appendix Q of the International Residential Code to develop tiny houses as either detached accessory dwelling units, affordable housing solutions, and starter homes for young families. Participants will examine how small-scale housing can also support aging in place for elderly singles and couples looking to downsize and promote diverse mixed-income housing developments. The course will focus on the health, safety, and welfare aspects of designing, permitting, and constructing code-compliant small dwellings, ensuring the equitable access and long-term community benefits. Everything that's required for this course is kind of baked into the content. So we're just kind of going to burn through these things, and you will be able to pick all this up during the presentation. Going back to what I explained before, having a clarity of purpose, the reason I got into architecture was to discover a viable solution to provide housing that is affordable, and by so doing, assist people to increase their standard of living so they can afford to live into their full potential. That was what I pinned down as what I wanted to be able to do. Okay, and then architecture just became the platform or the vehicle for how to accomplish that purpose. So how Appendix Q came to be. So in 2015, I was contacted by a tiny house company named Seattle Tiny Homes, and they asked if I would go to a tiny house conference in Portland, Oregon. And I went down there, and there were about 500 attendees over a 3-day conference. And there were, I think, about 15 different tiny houses that just filled this parking lot, and everybody could kind of go inside them. And I was hired by Seattle Tiny Homes to take one of their products there to showcase. And what was interesting is while I was there, I was able to meet a gentleman named Andrew Morrison. And so Andrew Morrison is an architect from the Portland, Oregon area, and he had spent a long time trying to design different floor plans, and he came to a pretty interesting conclusion, which was that when you incorporate stairs into a tiny house, so a normal tiny house at the time, was on an 8-foot wide trailer by however deep. And if you're having stairs that are built to code, then it's minimum 3 feet wide. And if you're going up just 9 feet, for 8-foot level, then you automatically have 15 feet of run for your stairs, and then you have 3 feet landings on either side. And so you have, suddenly you have 21 linear feet, and then you calculate that out, and that's comes out to about 64 square feet. That's just for your stairs. And so if you're on a 20-foot trailer, then and you have say even if it was with the one that we have, which was a 20-foot trailer, then it's almost 50% of the footprint is just the stairs. And so Andrew Morrison basically just came to the conclusion, it was like that doesn't work. And so we have to come up with a way to figure out a legal precedent for how to get around stairs, because it seems like even in any code situation, railings and stairs are something that inspectors are sticklers on. So what Andrew Morrison did is he came up with the idea to create a new code for tiny houses on foundations. And so what was interesting is that, so he and a colleague of his, they got together to write this code, and they traveled to the International Residential Code Council to pitch Appendix Q to this enormous group of people, where there were hundreds of people in attendance. And the International Code Council works like a democracy, like you can vote on things. And so he was able to present this Appendix Q, and because it's to an international community, the majority of the members are not from the United States or from other countries that have similar standards as we do. And so what they proposed, they said Appendix Q is for 400 square feet or smaller on a foundation. And what was interesting about the response from all these other people in all these other countries around the world is they said 400 square feet is the average size home in our countries. And so, like, of course we're going to approve this. And so it got approved. It got approved. And so in 2015, the latest iteration of the IRC had already been published. And then they were able to get this approved after that. And so it was approved as an appendix. And so because it wasn't included in the IRC 2015 iteration, nobody knew about it. And so what happened is that even though it had been passed legally as a code, what I asked Andrew, I was like, well, what do you do then for the jurisdictions that have no awareness of this code? And this is what he said. He's like, you have to go hand in hand, and you have to educate them, and you have to say, would you please adopt this code in this municipality? And so you were still at the behest or at the mercy of each of these jurisdictions on whether or not they would choose to adopt it. And some of them wouldn't. They'd be like, no, we're not interested in that. And so I kept tabs on this because I was kind of interested in it. And so in 2018, that's when Appendix Q was formally in the entire 2018 IRC. So when the 2018 IRC was adopted in any different municipality, it automatically has Appendix Q in it. And so it was July of 2020 that the city of Spokane adopted the 2018 IRC. And by so doing, they unwittingly adopted Appendix Q, even though nobody knew about it. And so it was pretty interesting. And so going back towards what Andrew Morrison decided to try and make kind of these adjustments or changes to it, he left everything the same in terms of structural foundations. Everything else is based on the prescriptive codes found in the IRC. The only exceptions that he needed is like, we need to find a way to win back some space in building these things. And so he proposed being able to have variable tread heights going as high as a foot. And so that way you could cut your run in half. And so instead of, having 20 feet, you could have 10 feet of run with your landings. And then he said that 3 feet is awfully wide and taking up your space. And so he's like, how about we go 17 inches? And so between 17 to 22 inches for your width on your stairs. And all of that got approved. And then one of the other things, it's a big thing for stairs in the normal code, is you have to have a head height of 6'8". And he was able to cut that down to 6 feet. And so if you have a head height of 6 feet, on a second level, then you're fine. And then something that I think is kind of interesting, in terms of the code, the Appendix Q code, it's pretty vague on the second level. And so the Appendix Q is 400 square feet for the base level footprint. And then I think it will depend on the municipality on if they will allow a full 400 square feet on the next level, if that makes sense. And so if there is a municipality that is a stickler on that, since it's a gray area, luckily there are some wins that you can win back with mezzanine code, right? In the normal IRC, where you can do mezzanines that are up to 50% of the footprint, that don't count towards the square footage. And so with that, so here in Spokane, as far as all the interactions I had with the city, they were extremely lenient, and they thought that this was a really cool product. All the inspectors that we worked with when we did this project were super cool. And like working with the city of Spokane was awesome in doing this product. And so one of the quick things that I just want to give is just like a history lesson. So around 2015 was when the tiny house movement had gotten the most momentum. It was at its peak. It's when there was TV shows being made about it. Everybody was going crazy. And it was right around that time that they were thrown in with the RV, into the RV category. So before that, as I was following, because I was watching it really closely, because I'm like, okay, like there's RVs which have no structural requirements, actually. Not sure if anybody knows that. So RVs have no structural requirements, period. And then you have like a normal home on a foundation that has normal framing. And then you had these tiny houses, which was kind of this hybrid where, you know, it has stick framing, but it's on a trailer. And so suddenly it was like, it was apparent to everybody who was making them that this new thing deserved its own category. Like it deserved a new category. And so even though while they were building them, there were all these people who were making them, they were kind of crossing their fingers that the codes and the code creators would create a new category for this new product.
Just jumping in here, one thing I want to add in there is that when the tiny houses were thrown into the RV category, it basically was instantly apparent to everyone who had been building them that they had been investing in Zeppelins, like the equivalent of investing in Zeppelins. Like all that time had been wasted. So it was like extremely deflating because they're like, okay, like now that we've been like working on these and we thought that these like would really become like a viable product, like it ended up to not be the case.
And so there was two things that happened. So banks looked at them and were like, well, how much does it cost to make these? And at the time, you know, 2015 and pre-2015, you could build a really nice one for under $50,000. And banks said, well, that's a huge threat to us. If this becomes a viable product, a huge amount of our money is made on mortgages for homes. And so if this replaces a significant percentage of homes, we're not going to make any money. And so banks were threatened by tiny houses. And so instead of getting behind them, they'd be like, no, we don't finance that. Like, and so you couldn't get financing for a tiny house. And so one of the things that happened with that, there's not very many people who have $50,000 in cash to build a tiny house out of pocket. So suddenly, very, very few of them ended up getting built relative to how many people wanted them, if that makes sense. And then when it was assigned to the RV category, at least the builders that I knew who had been building a couple of them, Seattle Tiny Homes and a couple others, they were devastated when it was thrown into that category. That was took a lot of wind out of their sails. It was really disappointing. And then the third thing was there were jurisdictions, a lot of cities saw this new product, and then I think that they were afraid that they would look like dilapidated RV parks. Does that make sense? And so they were afraid of basically them coming in and then deteriorating the quality of the city. And because it was a new thing and they hadn't really been able to look at it, um, the different cities were also threatened by tiny houses and were not very accepting to them. And I think one of the only cities that was progressive in that way was Portland, Oregon. And they very, very quickly, because they had a housing shortage there, realized like, hey, this could be something that that becomes a good thing. And so, which was why there was so much popularity for tiny houses in Portland at the time. And so, and just as an interesting side or aside to that, as far as I know, between all the work with the different jurisdictions and municipalities and getting codes permitted, just by accident, was able to visit with Bonner County and the city of Bonner County, which is like Sandpoint, Priest River, that entire area. They actually created a new category for tiny houses specifically, which is pretty interesting. So on a property up there, and this is why I think that Bonner County is the leaders there, the decision makers who decided to do this, I think is really neat that they're trying to serve their people up there, which I think is really neat. So what they can do is you can have a primary residence, and then you can have an ADU, and then you can have a third. You can have a recreational ADU, which is a tiny house on a foundation. I'm sorry, a tiny house. And I don't even think it has to be on a foundation. It can just be on a trailer. But they created a new category just for tiny houses. And it took a long time for them to do that. But I think that was a pretty sensible thing to do, because they are not RVs. They age like houses. They, in terms of the quality, right? The products age like houses, and they look nice, years and years from now. Like, so that tiny house that you saw at the beginning, in the pictures of it, it was built in 2015, and that's what it looks like now. Like, those pictures are very, very new, and that's how good it looks 10 years later, which is pretty exciting. So to the credit of Andrew Morrison, we have the Appendix Q code, and as a result of the work that he has done, we're able to win back some real estate inside the footprints for stairs, head heights, and second levels. And so I'm going to share a few lessons along the way that I picked up between 2015 and now. One of the things that I did was I decided that I wanted, just because I was in college, I decided I wanted to create the most detailed tiny house plans that existed, so that anybody could look at them and kind of build it like the Lego set. And so I tried to do a Kickstarter to fundraise this project, and that didn't work out, but I was able to partner with Seattle Tiny Homes, and we were able to make that product, which was pretty cool. But in the process of doing all that work on that Kickstarter, our Kickstarter got national attention. Like, we were contacted by CNN. They're like, if you reach your goal, we want to be able to interview you. And we weren't able to reach it, but a lot of the content that we were kicking out got hundreds of thousands of views on social media, which was pretty fun, because that was right at the peak of that, tiny house movement. So in the process of that, we became pretty good friends with a gentleman named Brad Cattell, and he goes by Darby, and he started a company called Texas Tiny Houses. And so he had been building tiny houses for about the last 30 years. So he had a huge head start on building tiny houses. And one of the things that he told us is, he's like, hey, just believe me on this. It's almost impossible to make something that's 8 feet wide functional and comfortable to live in. And so he said, he's like, what's crazy to me is, like, so you just take 3 feet You just take 3 more feet and you take 8 feet and you go to 11 feet. And suddenly you'll break into this entirely different realm where he's like, and I call it space magic. And if you plan it just right, even though the space can still be very small in terms of square footage, how functional it is just absolutely incredible. And so if you
So again, one thing I want to hop in here and add to that is that so many people are like, oh, well, if I keep it 8.5 feet wide, then I can just pull it whenever I want to with a truck and move it. And if you go to 11 feet wide, then it becomes like, or 11 or 12 feet wide, it becomes an oversized load, right? And people are afraid of, you know, like how much that costs, right? Because then you have to have pilot vehicles in front and behind to make sure that you know, to warn people of where you're going or whatever. And there's added cost to that. So when you're doing an oversized load going anywhere, like it's like minimum $2,500, right? That you have to pay for, you know, the oversized load permit. You have to route where it's going to go. And you have to do all those types of things. And so but what people don't realize is that once it's very difficult to find a place to put a tiny house. And once you put it there, because it is so hard to put it there and get it situated, you don't want to move it. Like you don't want to move it very often. And so with that said, in my opinion, it's totally worth it to make it bigger and then just get an oversized load permit. That way you have the extra space, and then and it's going to be rare that you move it anyway. And if you ever do have to move it, then just pay for the oversized load permit, and just take that extra expense hit. Like the enjoyment that you're going to get on the extra space on the inside is going to be worth way more than it is to pay that oversized load permit fee.
You spend a lot of time on your floor plans and you make them at least between 11 to 12 feet by whatever, then you're going to like break into that space magic zone. I kept that in mind and just kind of like tucked that away for later. While I was in college, I did an internship in Salt Lake City, Utah, for a company that specialized in making high-end residential homes using shipping containers. That was a pretty interesting internship. And while I was there, I had a sister who found a yurt that was for sale in Moab, Utah. And she asked if I would help her go and get it. We went down to Moab, Utah, and it turned out that this yurt was on a hippie compound. The land had come on for sale, and a retired engineer had purchased this 80-acre parcel that had this hippie commune on it with all these different buildings that had been built by the hippies in this group. But I was visiting with him, and he said the hippie commune community imploded, and they all do. When everything is common, there's not any private space. So people need private space. And so I just kind of, again, took that and I'm like, that makes sense to me. And then I tucked that away. I'm like, okay, like while common spaces are important, it's essential to plan in private or personal spaces as well, so that, you know, people don't go crazy.
To add to that is, like, I think that so for introverts especially who need to recharge by being alone, if there's not enough personal space, you know, where you can, you know, go off and recharge, then of course, you know, communities like that are going to implode. Like there's just, in my opinion, it's like no way to get around that. And so I think that when I say like it's essential or critical to, you know, calculate in personal space. And I think that one of the other things as well that I didn't mention in this is that part of any of these communities or different situations where you're trying to build a community that has mixed demographics, that can be sustainable in terms of how it encourages interaction between everybody. that one of the things that needs to be done is you've got to basically create a culture in advance for that community, so that very similar to a company culture, that and just as difficult as it is to build a company culture, you have to put a lot of energy and thought into that. What kind of culture do you want to have? And then anybody who wants to be a member of that community is looking at that culture and saying, that is something that I want to be a part of. That's something that I want to buy into, right? And so that way, the by having a culture, like a culture of a community, it by doing that, you can make sure that the culture outlives the founders of whoever sets up the community, right? Because then that community can perpetuate. And just like in a company, every single new hire, right? Every new person who comes in to the company changes the dynamic, right? It's going to influence that culture. And so every single time a new person or a different person moves into a home in a community, then the dynamic of the neighborhood changes, right? And so, but if you have basically like an established culture of expectations of things, that this is just things that are done in this community. And so one of the examples of things to do for that is like to have like a monthly potluck. Like that's just it's just like an open-ended thing. If your schedule doesn't allow it, then that's fine, but you're encouraged to come. In that way, it's just a time for, people to hang out and do things like that. And then where there are, designated public places for doing laundry, so that again, of course, like you could do laundry on your own, but there's like a actual like community, like a laundry facility and drying facility, so that people can interact a little bit more. And then same thing with gardening, right? Where if space is limited, it can be as simple as an herb garden, to where everyone's growing all the herbs that they would need to use in the kitchen. And then if there's enough space, that it could be a much larger community garden where you actually can grow, significant produce and things like that.
The next thing I'm going to talk about is just a quick history lesson on Ildefons Cerda. For those who have studied architecture, you're probably familiar with him and some of the work that he's done. So he was one of the first urban planners in the world in the early 1800s. Barcelona, up until that point, had a huge wall built around the city to protect it from invaders. And once it had gotten to that level, they're like, we really don't need this wall anymore. And it's kind of limiting how we can build the city. So they decided to tear the wall down, and then they had a competition to see who could design the inside of what had been inside the walls. And so Ildefons Cerda was an engineer, and he was well connected politically to the upper class, and he was brilliant in how he approached his proposal for Barcelona, which was used. And it's how the city of Barcelona is built today. And so what was pretty interesting about it is he was able to approach it in a very scientific way. And he did a tremendous amount of study. So for example, he would go into the homes of the upper class, and he calculated like what's the square meters per person for the wealthy, and what's the square meters per person for the ultra poor. And he was able to find that the ultra wealthy had an average of 3.6 square meters per person in the spaces that they lived in, and the poor class had 0.9 square meters per person.
So one thing I want to add to that is that like I admire how much Ildefons Cerda, like how scientific he was in his approach to figuring out everything. It was remarkably scientific, with so much research. It was super, super cool. But one of the things I want to throw in here is that I think that now, as a result of technology, that 0.9 square feet per person can actually work. And the reason why is because like back in the day, if you had like a washing room, or you had to go to a river or whatever to like wash your clothes, it could take up a lot of space, like the wash basin, different things like that. You might need like a designated space and things like that. Now we have so many options for washers and dryers and combined washer and dryer units. And so similar to like RV living, it can be so efficient, right? Like RVs, everything is so packed and tight. And so I think that as a result of technology and extreme creativity in all of the vast variety of appliances that are available today, that very small square footages can actually be very livable, which wasn't the case back in 1800, but it is now. And I think that's an important thing to note.
And so he was able to figure out things like that. And so he came up with this plan, which is called the Mansana. And so he had these kind of like this concept to build it in boxes. But what he did is he designed it to where he wanted it to be very open and be able to encourage interaction. So what's kind of interesting about these things is that each one of these letters is the proposed limit was to go to about 16 meters, which is about 3 or 4 floors for us. And so each one of those letters going through the alphabet would accommodate, around 25 units.
And correction on that would be between 24 to 32 units.
Each one of those individual pieces would be its own like self-contained community, but they would all face out, and all of the space on the inside would be green space, garden space, and then all of those spaces would face those, and then that way it would encourage interaction that way. And so this was pretty groundbreaking, and I've never been to Barcelona, but from what I understand, it's still used as a model for a walkable city and sustainable city, very green, and just beautiful in general. So keep that in the back of your mind for kind of like these things that Ildefons Cerda pioneered back in the 1800s. So by accident, while I was doing this internship, my roommate at the time needed a desk when we first got there. So he got onto Craigslist and he found a desk for sale in South Jordan in a new development that had just been started, and most of it was still just fields. It had been stripped and been ready to be developed, but there were only pockets of it that had been developed and built yet. And so we went there, we pulled up on the side, and I started looking at this development, and I got out of the car and I just started staring at it. And I just started kind of like thinking through it, and I'm like, oh my gosh, I'm like, this is kind of brilliant. We parked down here on this side. We were looking up this. So I was looking on this kind of up that avenue. And so I noticed a couple things. So the first thing that I noticed was that it was really similar to the layout of Ildefons Cerda, where you have this center point in between that's shared and common between everybody. But then what I noticed as well is that every single one of these homes had enormous front porches. And just observing, and there were probably 3 different groups of kids, and there was loads and loads of kids that were playing in these fields in the middle, and all the parents were on the porches, hanging out, talking to each other. And I had never seen a neighborhood like that before that had that much interaction. It was really neat, and I just stood there and I just watched it. And then when my friend, had gotten the desk and we loaded it into his car, and we just stood there and we just were talking about it and noticing and pointing things out to each other. So one of the things that we picked out is we're like, okay, all of the garages are accessed from the back. The garages are hidden, and the alleys were so tight that you really couldn't see into the alleys. And so you really could only focus on the architecture of the homes. and the sides and the fronts of the homes were really well designed, and they were just beautiful to look at. And there were so many different floor plans that there was just a lot of variety. It like there wasn't a single one of the homes that was the same. And so it just gave a lot of visual variety. And then the next thing that we noticed, having, just gone to like the hippie commune, is that every single one of these also had private space. They had their own private patios in addition. And then we looked at the parcels in general, and each of the parcels was I think less than a tenth of an acre. Like they were really small. And so what they were able to do with these is the entire Daybreak development. The concept of it was to basically make the parcels as small as humanly possible. And so say instead of having it be a quarter of an acre, they would make it a tenth of an acre, and then the other 0.15 acres they would put in one area, and they would take all of that from all of the other parcels, and then they would create a park. And then so off to the side of these different areas, there were enormous park areas, playground equipment and all kinds of things, or ponds. And so what happened is, so while I was there in 2015, this wasn't all built out yet. And through the years, I've kind of like checked up on it. And what they've done is they've continued to add different housing products to it. So it isn't just houses like these. Some of them are bigger, some of them are smaller. Now you have apartments, you have mixed use buildings. And so, but it started with these, which I thought was pretty interesting. These can work for Appendix Q, right? Like you could build Appendix Q this way, where you put garages on the back. But I'm gonna show a quick example of why I don't personally think that's a good idea. I believe in building houses for people, not for cars. And I'll show you what I mean. If you look at the actual residence of this house on the left, like this is the only part that's for living. Half of this structure is just for the cars. For me, the way that I like architecture is if you can tuck the garages in the back or into the side, or have a carriage house or something like that. That's just a personal preference for me. I think that when you have so much garage that it dominates the architecture, and it's hard for the architecture to be successful, in my personal opinion. So instead of doing it this way, I stole some concepts from Scandinavia, from Finland and Denmark. And so what they do is, instead of having all of the garages be connected, they take all that space and then they throw it and they lump it to one side. And then once you take out all the different walls and the eaves, then you can compact all the garages into just that size. So this isn't a new concept for a lot of things we see around here. Is in what they do is they just build one large carport for everybody to share. And then as far as carports go, however you want to address the architecture for it is up to whatever designer. And making it look interesting can be a challenge for that particular designer.
I mean, something to add here too, is that in Finland and areas like that, they also have a shared garden shed. So there's one lawnmower that everybody shares, but it's like a really good lawnmower. And then it's like all the same garden equipment. So instead, like the alternative is the way that, we normally do it with normal residential single family homes, right? Is every single family has their own lawnmower and their own set of garden tools in their own shed, right? And so, down a street of 15 houses, you have 15 lawnmowers and then all that other stuff. And so the efficiency of it just like makes tremendous sense, to where if you can have a shared garden shed, where it's like one killer awesome lawnmower that's like super dependable, and then all the rakes and such that you could need, and shovels for whatever other things that people are doing in their yards. And that way it saves on a tremendous amount of space, and it just seems extremely sensible to me.
What I was able to get clarity on was I want to be able to help provide solutions for entry and latter end life housing and entry level housing alternative to condominiums. And I think that Appendix Q is a viable solution for that. my wife and I, kind of by accident, we moved into this neighborhood where there just happened to be a couple other families that had children at the same ages as ours. But then there, across the street, there were also a couple families that where the couples were in their 80s. And that was the coolest community because we had like built-in grandparents, like multiple sets of grandparents. And they changed their input and their advice to me, changed how I parented my kids for the better. And my kids loved those old men specifically. Like they just loved hanging out with them. And we had a really wonderful sense of community built there. And that's when, you know, it was like a huge aha moment for me where I was like, I think that having mixed demographics is best. That that having young couples and older couples is actually extremely complementary. And so that's how I was able to come to that conclusion. All right, so the whole reason that my wife and I did this this tiny house on a foundation was to get the numbers. I was like, all right, does it pencil out? Luckily, when I was working at Bernardo Wills, it was a blast to be able to do a lot of like site analysis for projects. And so we were able to do a lot of work with developers and helping them identify if projects pencil out or not. This was basically an experiment to see if this pencils out, to see if it can be a viable solution for housing that developers could pursue. Here's something I want to share about that really quick. So I love this quote by Walt Disney. He said, "We don't make movies to make money. We make money so we can make more movies." And so I just want to swap out the word movies and put housing there instead. So if a company is profitable, it is evidence that society values that company. If a product isn't profitable, then it doesn't provide value to society. So in order to provide value to society, projects need to generate profit. If a real estate project doesn't make profit, then the developer behind that project doesn't get to do another one. So it is critical that real estate developers specializing in housing are able to make profit so that they can continue to make more housing in the future. I think for some reason, especially like, I feel like my generation like demonizes making profit. But if developers don't make any money, they won't be able to do it again. And housing, like we already have like a shortage of it, they need to be able to make money. And if they can't make money, it's not going to happen. And so the whole reason that my wife and I did this Appendix Q experiment was to see if it pencils out. Like, can it be profitable for developers to do this? I kept track of all of the hours that it took to do every single aspect of the work. And so, and whenever I hired something out, I had them keep track of their hours, and I kept track of every single piece of it. And the reason that I kept track of the hours is because where I grew up in Elk, Washington, which is about an hour north of Spokane. Contractors in Elk charge a lot less than contractors on the South Hill. And so depending on which region that you're in, and same thing where my wife, she's from South Pasadena, California, contractors in South Pasadena, California charge a lot more than contractors on the South Hill. And so depending on where you are, costs will vary drastically. But if you know how many hours it takes, like how many man hours it takes for every single aspect of the work, then you can still calculate those hourly rates into that time and know if it pencils out in that area. So that was why I kept such close care of it. So it turned out that from beginning to end in putting this tiny house on a foundation and putting an addition on it, it took 69 days from the time that we started to the time we finished it, which is a pretty quick build. And because it was an existing tiny house on a trailer, it was the second day that it had fully functioning plumbing and water, because all of it was already there. And so once we put it on the crawl space, and it took us one day to do all the plumbing to connect everything. And by day 2, it was a fully functioning house, which made it a really nice work trailer as we did it pretty much through the winter. starting in January. And so it was a pretty quick build. And so 69 days, 556 hours, it averaged 8 hours a day of actual time between all those laborers. Then this is kind of the final numbers that we're able to pin down. It turned out that the total cost to build it, including the cost of the tiny house that we purchased, was $100,000. Once it was completed, we had it appraised, and it was appraised for $186,000. So right out of the gate, we had $86,000 in equity, which was pretty cool. And you know what developers do is once they get enough equity, then they do cash out refinance, and then they just roll over the extra payment on the mortgage on whoever the tenant is, and then they take that money and they do it again. And that way they're able to take that project, and then the cash out refinance finances the next project. So that's what we were hoping to do, but then the interest rates got away from us. And so we timing wise, we didn't quite win on that to be able to do the second one. Once interest rates go down a little bit more, then we can take a look at that again. All right, so factor in the land cost. That little parcel was worth $50,000 that we built the tiny house on. We already owned the property, and so we didn't have to pay that amount. But if we had to pay for the land, it would have been a total of $150,000, and then sell them for $230,000. So that's a profit of $80,000. And is that enough profit margin to be worth it for a builder or a developer? And so I went and visited with a developer to kind of run this by him. And his answer was, for one, no. He's like, that's not worth it. That's not enough profits.
And the reason I want to hop in here and say the reason that's not enough profit is because every real estate project, the fastest ones take 2 years to get off the ground. And that was still true of this project. From the time, that I did all the work into figuring out how to do this to getting it permitted and getting it built probably was about 2 years. And so to invest 2 years of your life to get $80,000 is a terrible return. And so that's why it isn't worth it to do that for just one. There's another builder who does spec homes that I know, and around that same time, he did a spec home that sold for $750,000, and it only cost him $250,000 to build it. So he walked away with $500,000 in 1 year. And so when you compare that to building one of these, and then it comes out to $40,000 a year, then to ask builders who are making really good returns on spec homes to come and build something like a tiny house on a foundation, the returns are so low that it would be absurd to expect them to be interested in that. It's just not enough to do just one.
For just one. And so a lot of the established developers in Spokane are looking for a certain profit margin, right? And for a return on investment. And but what he said is, he's like, but if you built 6 at a time, then it would totally be worth it. And so he's like, so that's what I think you should do. He's like, I think that if you were to do this, he's like, and that would be the best way to test demand as well. Build 6, and then if you can sell those quickly enough, then you'll know for sure. And so that will be the next thing that my wife and I take on, will be like doing that as a test run. And this is a big point on that. Banks will finance real property with mortgages as low as $100,000, right? And so what that means is that banks can make money off of Appendix Q, and profit means value, like we talked about already. And that's good, because that means if banks can profit, then that means Appendix Q is here to stay, right? It isn't going to be a movement that passes away like the tiny house movement. And that's an important thing. So is it possible? Yes. Is it worth it? For a single person and infill housing, say if you're doing this as an investment property, it's totally worth it, right? For developers, it would need to be done more than one at a time. the tiny house that my wife and I built, the lot that we had was a corner lot, and the setbacks were such that we were only allowed a buildable width of 14.5 feet. And so we did the best we could with between the existing tiny house and that allowable buildable area. And had we been able to go wider, we definitely would have. We would have made this larger if we could have. But the lot constrained us to do what we did. After it was completed, I was like, okay, if we had a lot that did allow us to build to the full 400 square feet footprint, because that tiny house is only 283 square feet on the bottom level. And it is incredibly efficient. And so I'm like, okay, it's 283. What would happen if we went to the full 400 square feet? And how much more comfortable can we make it if we were to do that and still be within the Appendix Q? So that's what I did. So what I did is, you come in here, and then the way that this is set up is like an office. So it's like kind of like desk height, almost like counter height for here. And then under this is a compact combined washer dryer unit for space saving. And those have come a long way over 10 years. Like 2015, they were awful. Now they're actually really nice. And then going into the kitchen, when the installers came to bring in the granite countertop, because this is granite and then all of this is granite, what they told us, so they were like, this is actually pretty amazing. They're like, the square footage on the countertop that they were installing for this tiny house, this is the average amount of countertops that we install in any apartment that we built. Now, I thought that was pretty interesting, and kudos to my sister. Then what I did is I just took one of the standard ADA bathrooms that we built on the many apartments when I was working in the industry, and I just tacked that onto the end. I'm like, okay, well, if you put a full ADA, which takes up a ton of space, by the way, like say a normal bathroom is like 5 feet by 8 feet, right? And so this is easily twice as big as that for a fully ADA accessible bathroom. You have your circle in the middle. I think it's like 5.5 feet now for a turnaround radius. And so, whereas, if you wanted to, this could either be for like an aging in place single or couple. And you could even put a washer and dryer between the toilet and the shower if it wasn't ADA accessible, right? So if you didn't want to have a washer and dryer here, like there's enough space in that floor plan that you could put it in other places. And then what I did is I enlarged this, and instead of having the stairway be here to get up into the loft, I tucked it down around in here, following the code of the Appendix Q, so that it's a higher rise, and that way the stairway is hidden, and then you have a larger space. And so if this was, if you're shooting for like really low cost, then you could do this as a single level, and then this could just be like a studio apartment, and this could be extra just closet space. But if it was a 2-level, then you could have this be like living and dining, put your dining table and then TV or wherever you want it. For us, we have a sliding glass door that goes out to the side of the backyard, and that's how that's accessed from here. And so that would be level 1. And then if you had a second level, then you'd come up, and up here you'd have enough space either for like an office or play space, craft space, whatever. You'd have enough for like parents in a child bedroom. And so this would be functional for a small family. And so the Appendix Q approach for like entry-level housing would totally be with the understanding that families are going to grow out of these, right? Like this is just a way to get their foot into the door for like home ownership, and then they can offload it from there. So this is just a perspective of the ground level, and then a perspective of the second level.
One thing that I want to add is a quote that I found years ago, and later on I'll see if I can track down the exact quote, but it's from Ben Franklin, and I was reading a book on the founding fathers and some of the things that they said, and one of the things that he was talking about in terms in this one chapter. It was talking about how many of the founding fathers hated debt. Most of them were entrepreneurs and business owners, and they understood the danger of debt. And so uh, what Benjamin Franklin said in his quote was essentially that the the goal of every American should be to start with a small cottage, and I think he might have even called it a hovel, right? Where you start with a hovel, then you go to a cottage, and then you get to a small house, and by the end of your life, you have worked up to being able to have a manor or a mansion that you live in, and basically the essence that I got from that quote was the beauty in that approach, right? And I think that a lot of Americans want to skip the hovel, they want to skip the cottage, and they want to go straight to the mansion, right? But what Benjamin Franklin was basically teaching is that if you start small and you build up, then you can get to the mansion debt free. Whereas if you go directly to the mansion, then the house will own you instead of the other way around. And then we get the debt riddled prosperity, right? Where we may look um prosperous from the outside, but on the inside, like we're killing ourselves to handle the debt we've taken on.
And then this is what the shell would look like, is just like a standard, right? For a 2-level Appendix Q house. And so, and then if you go to something like this is something that's more along my style of what I like, that also incorporates all of the same things and all of those things that I learned in that kind of journey, right? So down here, you get more private space, but it also is outward facing. So kind of like a wraparound porch, to where you can invite, people from your community, and you can hang out up here. But then you also get like extra deck space if you wanted, where you could have even more intimate private space up here and blur the line between the in and the out. And that way kind of expand your living, to this level. But that way, if this was built in that same orientation, similar to the examples I shared earlier, then it still is outward facing and encouraging interaction with neighbors. I just want to do a quick shout out to a couple of people that you can find on YouTube really easily. So the first one is Jeremy McLeod, and I don't know how to pronounce the other guy's name. So he's from Finland, and I want to spend some time on Jeremy McLeod specifically. Jeremy McLeod specialized in building sustainable housing in Melbourne, Australia. And so you can check him out on YouTube. He has many, many different things you can check out on him. And I really admire what he does. This is just an example of one of the projects that he did. So this was for, I think, a $6 million apartment building. It cost $297,000 to build each unit. Each unit was only 270 square feet. And then they sold them for $215,000. And so there was a deficit of $82,000 that was subsidized by different housing organizations. And so there are exceptions. Some things are not profitable, still provide value to society, but the money has to come from somewhere. And so those partnerships can be made. All right, so quick demographics rundown. So when I was working with Seattle Tiny Homes, we found some pretty interesting things. And while we were doing our Kickstarter and doing all of those ad campaigns, we're able to see a lot of really interesting insights on the types of people who are interested in these types of products. And so by far, the largest demographic of people at the 2015 Tiny House Conference in Portland, Oregon, was single women 60 and up.
So one thing I want to add here too is that when we did that Kickstarter campaign on that tiny house project, the ads that I was running, each one of it was getting so much visibility and organic visibility where, people were sharing it and passing it along, where each one would get 100,000, 130,000 views. And so when you get that many views on something, then you can then look at the analytics and you can look at all of the different age ranges of people who are looking at it. And so when you're dealing with numbers that large, you can get pretty accurate numbers, right? For generating interest, right? This isn't just like 10 or 20 people that's interested in these things. And so every single time without fail, the largest demographic was definitely like the 50 to 60 and up single female category for sure. And the next closest one was women who were I think between 25 and 30, something like that. And in whether they were married or not didn't matter. It's just like so in general, it was women by far who were much, much more interested in tiny houses.
And one of them came up to me, and since I was representing Seattle Tiny Homes at the time, and she came up and she said, "I've had the white picket fence. I've done it all. I've raised my family in there, and I'm just looking for something that's a lot more simple and easier to clean. And I'm looking for a turnkey experience." She's like, "I don't want to build these myself. I'm looking for something that I can just buy." And it was interesting because there were so many people in that demographic who had that much money and then had that much interest. That example of Jeremy McLeod, he was expecting that it would be college students that would be interested in this housing. And it turned out that it was the same demographic that we found at a conference with Seattle Tiny Homes, that it was about, is the single women that are 60 and up.
The next thing that I wanted just to add in right there too is that it's 6 million, where each unit is 300,000, right? So that ended up being about an 18 unit development, and so that 18 unit is fairly close to the 24 unit target for the ideal size that you're looking for when you're shooting for building a community. And so that 18 unit like totally met that that target range.
One of the things that Jeremy McLeod also pinned down was kind of a nod back to Ildefonso Cerda. As soon as you get, he was studying high-rise demographics, and as soon as you get high-rise apartment buildings that have 70 occupants or more, it becomes logistically impossible for people to ever meet. And so the ideal size for people to actually have a sense of community is about 24 units. One of the things that Jeremy McLeod really is an advocate for, which I admire, is that architects aren't really the decision makers, and the contractors aren't really the decision makers. The people who really determine what gets built are the people who pay for it, right? They're the clients. And so it's the clients that control the evolution of the architecture industry. And so what McLeod is doing is like, let's use architecture as a platform to become architect developers so that we kind of shift into that position so that we can have more control of the products that are introduced into society. And so
one of the things I want to add to that is that architects are the ones who are the most connected to communities, right? They can kind of like have their boots on the ground. I think they're extremely connected to the inner workings of different communities. And because of that, they know, I think they have a much tighter pulse of what people would want and the type of products they'd be willing to buy into. And so like banks, for example, hate risk, right? So their banks really are not interested in alternative housing because it's new. They only want to invest in things that are tested and proven, right? And so so architects, in shifting into this architect developer mindset, they really are taking on a tremendous amount of risk in basically saying like, hey, this is the direction that housing should go, even though it isn't proven. And so there is a tremendous amount of risk there. But if architects don't do it, nobody will, because the developers are also very risk averse, and you can't blame them. And so with that, they also are not interested in for the most part are not interested in pioneering something. Most things that where pioneering takes place, there's no money in pioneering, because most pioneering fails. And so only successful pioneering is really profitable. And so the architect developer mindset, you'd really have to be, really dialed in to the needs of a community, so that when you know, present and provide this new type of product, a new housing alternative, that that it's a home run. Like you really got to be confident that what your building is so needed that that as soon as it's built, that there's going to be high demand for it.
So what he does with his firm is he does what a normal firm does, is they have all the normal work come in, but then they also work on other projects where they are the developers and they build these deals and then they design them themselves, which is pretty interesting.
So the other thing about that too, right, is that the minimum time to get a project off the ground is 2 years, right? But for a lot of these projects, between, connecting all the right people and making all the right connections for those relationships, might take 5 to 6 years. So if it takes, say, even on the low end, 4 years to get a project like this that the community needs off the ground, then and you have only a single lifetime, right, to work in, then if you have a career, right, of, let's say 32 years, and each one takes 8 years to do, then you can do 8 projects until you die. And so you really have to be careful what you choose to work on, because you only have so much time, and your time is limited. And so there has to be a way to make a alternative housing solution scalable, right? So that not only can you do it, but you can easily teach other people how to do it, so that it can spread like wildfire, and then take hold, and then become something that is proven, so that banks will then be able to invest in it, knowing that there is no risk there.
I'll just run through this really quick. So the idea would be to build Appendix Q housing in communities, but then also do it with the intent where eventually it would be kind of like the daybreak development, where other housing options would be added at a later date, to where you would have multifamily or apartments nearby added, so that as young families are growing out of these, they have other housing products that they can move into. So this is on a 4-acre parcel. And so this is doing the 6 unit per phase concept. I think carports are ugly for the most part. And so if I were to build something like this, I would just pay for the extra engineering to be able to bury it and to be able to create a berm out of it, and then convert it into functional real estate, either have it be garden space or playground space for children, and just have a railing around it. Like, that's what I would do. This goes through different phases. Like, this actually follows the code for that particular parcel. And so this would be the max number of residences allowed on that 4 acres. And so you'd start with tiny houses, and then you'd add a mixed use apartments with 6 apartments on the other side. So instead of 6 Appendix Q houses, because we ran out of space, then you would just do apartments and go up with the other available space. And that way you get that mixture, and then add businesses in between. And the idea would be going towards the same concept as in LEED, where you want to have businesses that can provide amenities to the people, so you have kind of a built-in clientele, and as many services as possible are within walking distance. And again, it's just like with the labels of how that could look, and then with the phases. Just in conclusion, I feel that everything in the architecture should follow the triple bottom line. which is it needs to make money, it needs to be good for the environment, and it needs to be good for society. And that is all for today's presentation. And I apologize for going over.
All right. And so the next thing I just want to add to that is, I think one of the only things I left out was that one of the reasons that was explained to me by Darby that every county has a set minimum square footage is that when counties were first established, there had to be enough taxes generated on property to support the local bureaucracy, right? And so they're like, okay, well, there's not very many people that live in this area, so homes have to be at least 1,200 square feet in order for us to be able to charge enough taxes to be able to make enough money to pay the people to run the local government. And so now, fast forward several hundred years, and now we, or I guess a couple hundred years, right? So you fast forward, and there's no longer a limit on people, right? There's lots of people, even in more like rural areas out in the country, there's still a lot more people, like far, far more people than there used to be. And so those original minimum square footages are irrelevant anymore. Like there's so many people that the local bureaucracy is going to be able to make enough money off of taxes just fine. Like they're going to be able to make their payroll. And so that is why Appendix Q is so important, is because it gets around those old laws on the minimum square footages that have become extremely detrimental, because there are some people who would love to build smaller than the minimums, but have not been allowed to. And nobody really knows why. Like, oh, the minimum says this. Be like, well, why is it that? Why can't I build smaller if I want to? And they're like, I don't know. You just can't. And so in the county where I grew up, in Ponderay County, there's the minimum square footage is 900 square feet. So you can't build smaller than 900 feet even if you want to. So what's really cool about Appendix Q is it gets around that. And so that if people want to live in smaller spaces and are willing to do that, and they are willing to design spaces that are extremely well thought out, so that they're extremely efficient to live in, then you can make 400 square feet extremely functional and surprisingly livable. And so I think that's one of the most wonderful things about Appendix Q, because then it basically just gives more freedom, right, to people on as far as more options for things that they can do with their own property, which is a beautiful thing. And one of the things I'll do is kind of a part 2 to this is I have been sitting down with a couple different friends to come up with an idea for how to solve the housing shortage in a creative way. So one of the biggest problems is, finding available land at a good price, right? Because if you can get the land at a good price, then you can put together a sensible real estate deal that pencils out, right? If the land costs too much, then then it just doesn't make any sense, and it doesn't pencil out to do any real estate development. So one of the biggest challenges is finding the land. And so a part 2 to this that I'm putting together will basically walk through as far as I know, a completely new concept of how to build communities like these, and how to find the land, and do it in such a way that there is tremendous abundance of land instead of a shortage, and have it to where everyone involved is extremely well compensated and rewarded. And because there's so many laws in place for housing and everything like that, and home ownership, that there's so much to rely on now that we can just plug that in and benefit from that. It can be very safe. Like you can approach it in a very risk averse way. So in terms of the owners of the land. It can be good for them. In terms of the developers, it can be good for them, and it can be good for the community because of the need for extra housing. So that'll be in a part 2 that I'll be putting up as soon as I can get to it.